Like, what was electronic leadership? That was very much a thought that's still concurrent today, but at the time we were asking about e-leadership, and that got me to think about what's the counterpoint.
Yes.
Of being of like, what is timeless and universal about leadership across cultures and across time, across civilizations? The two competencies that I talk about in the book are about consistency and integrity. And so consistency being that there are a consistent set of behaviors or a consistent set of values that we can count on, and that at times may unlock something in us. They may give us something aspirational when leadership is done at its best. And then integrity is as much about saying what you do and doing what you say. Three different pathways. If people are controlling, and we typically look at, well, what do you do outside of work? Like, how do you show up outside of work? Like, are you showing up in a way that's typically, are you likely to be controlling? And we see it in the 360, but also we're asking people to understand, get that self-awareness about where is the root of this exhibited behavior? And I experienced this when I became a CEO 20-something years ago, is that, your most precious commodities, once you get to the top of an organization, are time, truth, and trust.
Welcome to your journey to find true tranquility with the Tranquility Magazine podcast with your host, Jasmine Maya Royce. Today's episode featuring, you can find more information about tranquility on our website, tranquilitymagazine.com.
I am so excited for Jamie Ramsden, is the CEO with 25 years of international business experience. As an elite coach for the past 2 decades, he has worked with Fortune 500 C-suite clients, business owners, and entrepreneurs across the globe to drive consistent, sustainable results through strategy, people development, and scale infrastructure. Jamie trained at the Center of Creative Leadership and has been certified by the International Coach Federation. He is the CEO and founder of Adastra Consulting, the leadership development and an executive coaching company. His latest book, I'm very excited about. Let's Go, How Great Leaders Shape the Future. Thank you very much, Jamie. And my first question is always, what is your current mantra or state of mind?
Yeah. Well, I'm actually going to take it as 2 questions because I think, cheekily enough, my mantra has to be, let's go. Given the title of the book and, and how long we've been working on it, it has to be, let's go. And so, just getting people to be able to, like, certainly what I'm thinking about is how do we, in this very sort of chaotic world, how do we give ourselves direction and give ourselves the energy in order to just take action? So let's go. That's my mantra and has been for a while. But I'm also thinking about my state of mind is really just wishing, sort of compassion or peace upon people. There's a lot of, angst and anxiety and dissonance that's going on around us. You only have to pick up a newspaper or look at the news. And so my state of mind is one that's cautiously optimistic, but I just hope that people can find little pockets of peace as they go about their day.
It is true in both concepts in a way that you need to find your own inner peace to kind of navigate the current climate and, try to figure out your ways of, balancing that out, because news is driven to be fear tactics only. And it's sad to say that it can be related to that for many people, and finding your own elements and peace is really important. Mm-hmm. So how did you start on your course or your direction to become or go into leadership as a factor?
Yeah, well, I've always been fascinated by leadership, right? So it's always been interesting to me. I studied leadership and change management. So that was what I specialized in when I did my master's about 25 years ago. But even before that, I've always been interested in sort of leadership. Why does it exist? How is it manifested? What is its purpose? And I think really when I think about it, so I specialized in leadership and change management. And maybe sort of the root of this is something my mother always used to say to me. She said, Jamie, I always knew where to find you. I had to pick you up at school. I always knew where to find you. I'd find the biggest crowd and then I'd go to the middle of it. And so, by implication, she was sort of saying, you were a natural leader. I heard that a lot when I was younger. And so it got me curious about, well, what does that mean? Like, how does that show up? What is its purpose? And so I studied and specialized in it when I did my master's, leadership and change management. And that really is where the book came from, the thesis that I wrote at the time around leadership, which at the time was sort of being disrupted by technology, or at least we thought it was, nothing like what it is today. And so there was this question about what was e-leadership going to look like? What was electronic leadership? That was very much a thought that's still concurrent today, but at the time we were asking about e-leadership. And that got me to think about what's the counterpoint?
Yes.
Of being of like, what is timeless and universal about leadership across cultures and across time, across civilizations? And that really is the essence of the core of the book and the essence of the model that underpins it.
It's very important to understand, you just touched on the concept, digital entities or AI or abstractive human factors in it. So when you look at it now in the current evolution of technology and all kinds of concepts that are streaming so fast, it's always hard to keep up with. But what is some of the base understandings of the human factor that you kind of discovered as part of this?
Yeah. Well, I think, I sort of park this, the caveat, at least for now, is that for as long as human beings are leading other human beings, right? So we can talk about the interface of technology at some point, but the underlying principle of this is that if there are human beings that are managing or leading human beings, there are 4 dimensions or 4 areas in which that is expressed, through that which leadership is expressed. So I was asking earlier on about why does it exist and why is it expressed? That's really been in my mind for a long time. And my studies and my practice, and even being a CEO for a period of time, it's all been informed around why does it exist? And so there are 4 areas where leadership is expressed, right? It's expressed within the individual, i.e. the leader themselves. It's expressed within the team. And that can mean, like, people think of that team mean your direct reports, but it's actually a team or a group of people who are going to help bring your vision to life, right?
Yeah.
It's expressed within the context, because there are adaptations, even though there might be timeless and universal aspects of what we're doing, which is the sort of the what, the how can be informed by the context. And so the context, I always say, like 14th century Mongolia, leadership looks very different from 21st century Taiwan, right? The context will inform it, but the what is still the same. And then finally, we think about the mission, like what is it this group of people have been brought together to do? And so my definition of leadership as such is that it is galvanizing a group of people to build a better tomorrow. That's my concept. And it manifests itself in these 4 different domains. And as a result, when you're leading people, you have to, or you need to, adopt the 4 following roles. There's the role model, the community builder, the sense maker, and the future shaper. Those are the 4 roles that a leader plays that speak to the areas in which leadership is manifested.
It's always important because you recrafted the terminology that you use, and a wise choice of words to describe these different aspects of. Can you explain a little bit more about what are the archetypes that you're trying to express in the understanding of the value of being into a leadership, the role model, the community builder, and the sense maker? I love that one. Really great idea, but also makes true, and future shaper, which is also all about what leadership is like underpinning.
Indeed. Yeah. And so if you'll bear with me a second, I'll walk through the 4 of them, but also remembering that those 4, the reason why they've resonated through time is because they speak to 4 underlying human needs or desires that we have. And it's part of the reason why we give something up to leadership, and it's what we expect to take out of leadership. And so I'll talk about each of those dimensions, but I'll also talk about the underlying human need, which makes it so consistent when it comes to, leading humans. And so the first one is about role model, right? So when we look to our leaders, we're looking for somebody who has, some stature, presence, self-awareness. Typically, they handle pressure well, they have credibility, they're resilient, all these different, they have realistic optimism. These are different dimensions of being a role model. The 2 competencies that I talk about in the book are about consistency and integrity. And so consistency being that there are a consistent set of behaviors or a consistent set of values that we can count on, and that at times may unlock something in us. They may give us something aspirational when leadership is done at its best. And then integrity is as much about saying what you do and doing what you say. And so we look to our leaders to be consistent, even if they, there might be times where they don't share every single aspect of our perspective, but we are looking for them for consistency and integrity. And the reason for that we say underpins a sense of identity or a sense of self. That's the common universal theme that's underpinning it. But also in the absence of that, and we've all, I'm sure, worked with leaders like this who, on Tuesday say we're going in one direction, and then Thursday they show up in a different way, and then Monday it's a different direction. And that gives people whiplash. And so what that means is that they will tend to transact, they will tend to step back and withdraw, and they will not engage, at a heart level. They may engage at a head or a hands level. They may understand what I need to do. But that extra percentage, that unlocking the potential that's in other people and unlocking that group of people to be able to drive the mission forward, that typically doesn't happen.
Interesting.
So that's role models, right? So then community builder, right? This speaks to our sense of belonging, and that's a universal human theme. We've always, as human beings, from the moment we came together 10,000 years ago, we've constantly looked for something like looking for people, a group of people who share our interests or have a common goal or a common purpose. And so, the leader's role in that case is about the competencies associated with that is a focus on others and communication. So those are the two competencies that we look for. And, in a way to build that sense of belonging and that sense of community, right? And so, a leader's role is to be able to connect people together and to be able to create the conditions for that sense of belonging to occur. The third one you said you liked, so I'm going to jump into that,
yes.
which is sense making, right? And so this is appreciated or sometimes undervalued when I see it in the business case, which is we're looking for people who have a learning orientation and also a level of intelligence. And by that, I don't just mean cognitive, I'm talking about social and emotional intelligence. If you have those three things and a learning orientation, you can help make sense of the world. If I think back through sort of, famous sort of political or religious leaders or social leaders who've really resonated, they have made sense of the world for a large group of people. And those people are willing to then say, okay, I understand the paradigm, or I understand now what the context is. And the leader has helped me to do so. And so that speaks to our sense of meaning.
Yeah, empathy.
Meaning is different, sense of meaning is something that we constantly look for and have looked for as human beings. And then finally, to differentiate between meaning, the final sense is future shaper. And so you don't get to create the future, you're not in charge of that. There's too many variables, but you might get to influence it or shape it. And that gives us a sense of purpose. That's the underlying sense of purpose that we may have. And the difference between those two things, meaning is static, meaning is today, like how do I understand how the world works, is the rules of engagement. But purpose is more future facing. It is about how am I going to, given everything that I understand, where am I going to channel my efforts and how am I going to express my talents and how am I going to help this mission come to life? And so in future shaping, we're looking for leaders who have a vision and a bias for action.
Yeah, all always amazing aspects to kind of figure out the purpose of being in leadership and taking a creative role like that, or taking it on for someone that is starting out a business or has owned one, or even elevating their stature of where they are because it's not working right. I want to go back to the first one when you talked about role models. When you are faced with a client and you are doing an interaction to develop their core structure, meaning their how to become that person, what are some of the ways that you kind of help to navigate people to develop that strong character, so to speak, inside themselves?
Yes. And so actually, just it's worth saying that we have at Adastra, we have a 360 assessment tool that we did in partnership with the Center for Creative Leadership. And so they have a competency of a database, library of competencies that they have gathered over the last 50 years of people who've been through the program. And we've overlaid on top of that this model. So when I say that the competencies we're looking for in role model in particular are consistency and integrity, we actually have a 360 model that I use with leaders, typically C-suite leaders at the top of an organization, but it doesn't have to be. But we use this 360 model to see how you're being perceived by the people in your organization in each of these four dimensions. And so to your point, that's actually the one that is the hardest to fix, right? It's the one that, if people don't see you as being credible, or if you don't follow through on your promises, or if you have a very low say-do ratio, like I say this and I do that, and it's very low, not one for one, people, again, will tend to step back. They will tend to say, well, hang on a minute, like, I'm not sure that I believe in this person or I believe in where we're going. And they will tend to sort of withdraw or contract and then press pause. And so it's very hard. It's not impossible, but it's very hard. And so the first thing we do is take a snapshot of where they are today. working with leaders, it's like, well, how are you perceived by the people around you? Because they probably are not telling you.
It's true. So your group of your community or your, whoever you hired as your staff is not going to really tell you because they still want their jobs, but they're not going to give you that critical feedback. Yes.
Yeah. One of the things that I jokingly say is, and I experienced this when I became a CEO 20 something years ago, is that, your most precious commodities, once you get to the top of an organization, are time, truth, and trust. And so the truth piece, right? So do people tell you the truth? Well, they're not going to deliberately lie to you. That doesn't always happen, but they typically will either withhold or embellish or slightly filter the information as it percolates up. Mm-hmm. And if you can imagine, so at the top of an organization, there's many different areas that can filter through, or many different people that can filter through. And so truth gets distorted slightly. And so part of the leader's role in themselves is to try and, how do I elicit the truth? How do I ask people for feedback? How do I gain that information so that I can understand exactly where I am today? Not in a house of mirrors type of way where it's like, where it's distorted, but actually seeing the reality of the world as it is. And that's a challenge. So if we have that information and I'm able to get it through the assessment, probably more clearly than the leader can, and then hold up the mirror and say, this is what people are seeing. Yeah. If we see that it's off, then we do work on how to build credibility, how to build resilience, how to consistently show up, how to ensure that your behaviors are landing, that the impact of your behaviors is consistent with your intent.
True.
And so it lands with your team.
I think it's important, like what you touched on there about the idea of, finding the truth from other people that won't always give it to you, and your communication with your staff, fellow CEOs or C-suite people or anything like that, to gauge how your community, so to speak, is doing. And a lot of people, you touched on the idea of delegating tasks and how to give it to one person, the other, that you can't do everything. No matter what we think we're so good at, that you got into a leadership classification, you can't do it all. It's very impossible. But having to those check-in points also with your community to figure out how they're doing and what you can change, that's a hard factor. How do you execute kind of pushing people that direction that have too much control over their own company and can't really release it that much to kind of build on it?
Yeah, so, so concurrently, normally we'll do a 360, but we also do some psychometric assessments. And so that allows us to see how are they hardwired? And we typically talk about sort of your nature, like the essence of who you are, the nurture, how you were raised, and so how those things may have been reinforced in you. But also I consider the narrative, like what are you telling yourself on a daily basis? And so once we understand that, we do a psychometric assessment, which gives us a sort of a thumbnail. I don't get too attached to it, but it gives us an idea of where people may be, within a certain paradigm, right? So in your case that you just described, if somebody is not delegating, there may be many different reasons why they're not. One of them may be that they just like to be in control, right? But one of them may be that they haven't built a team, or they don't have a team, or they don't have people within the team that they trust, and so they are exercising their right to hold on to work. Or it may be that, or very high profile or a high stakes environment. And so with the psychometric profiling, we're able to sort of understand what the root of that might be, because you get 3 different dimensions or 3 different pathways. If people are controlling, and we typically look at, well, what do you do outside of work? Like, how do you show up outside of work? Like, are you showing up in a way that's typically, are you likely to be controlling? And we see it in the 360, but also we're asking people to understand, get that self-awareness about where is the root of this exhibited behavior? And once we understand that, then we can help give them the self-awareness to say, okay, well, what is a different approach? Like, what is a muscle I need to flex? And how do I need to develop myself across this spectrum or this paradigm that I may be on? I may be at one end or another. What is the good and the bad of being at one end? And what is the good and bad of stretching that and being at the other end? And so, that allows you to deploy. I typically say that, it means that you then have the choice. Let's just say, if you have the capacity to be able to operate at either end of any given scale, and in this case, we're talking about delegation or empowerment, control. If you can operate where you can be if you need to, but you can also release control based on certain conditions, and you can do both, then at that point, then you're not in your own way. You're not the person who is holding the team back, right? You're actually able to exercise whatever the situation calls for. It's what the conditions call for. And the great leaders that I've worked with are able to flex along that spectrum. more easily than others. They're able to adapt to what the circumstance calls for, not what they think that it needs, or what their ego tells them, or what their experience tells them, or what anything else might be telling them they need to do. They're actually able to stand back and say, well, what does the situation call for? And I will adapt, or I will deploy assets accordingly, or I'll bring other people in who are really skilled in these areas. And that is the fundamental underpinning of self-awareness. If you have that as a leader, if you can see that your strengths and your weaknesses, and you can understand that your ability to be able to develop those, mitigate the downside, and also lean into the upside, right? That self-awareness is a central part. It's a very critical part of being a good leader.
It's very true, like the idea, and then what you're elemental of the idea of change. And in life, sometimes you need to adapt, you need to evolve, you need to let go of former ideas that you thought worked before, and how to kind of escalate your process to swing either way that you mentioned, or to find a new trajectory. And I've seen so many people like too locked down in the element that change is like an unseen force. Even if you have your own company, you've never ran it, it's like too confusing, or you're taking a leadership role, or it is the darkness of the unknowns. But also in that, like going in with your, armor, everything that you've packed and learned with you to kind of go that direction, and you're ready for onset of war or whatever it is, so to speak, yes. Mental, outside self, everybody else, and how to kind of brace for that. But you're bracing in like a lockdown, like you're not really able to adapt. So how do you help people kind of implement that wave that they have to be more flexible?
Yeah. Well, my starting point for this is I always differentiate between people. I would say people don't fear change, they fear being changed. And so, because if I decide that I want to do something, or if you decide that you want to do something, Jasmine, right? And you really put your mind to it, then we better get out of the way.
Yeah.
So you will embrace change in a way that, that we better just step back and watch you work. Whereas if we try and impose change on you, or if you see uncertainty and you think change is coming towards me, right? I don't have any agency. It is happening to me. Even if that change is ultimately productive, we can still resist. And so this is the idea. And I think there's a chapter in the book about, contracting or expanding. And change typically gets us to be fearful, right? And it gets us to withdraw and contract.
Yes.
What I typically encourage people to do in times of great change is to remember that all of the skills and experience they have, that can be ballast or it can be fuel, right? It can weigh you down, or it can energize you and drive you through. But if you're not able or comfortable to be able to be courageous and to push through that discomfort that you may feel, right? And to create that sense of agency yourself, that you are in control of change. You can control how you adapt to circumstances. It's really just it sounds like a very small mindset shift, but it's thoroughly empowering for people when they say, okay, I can see the circumstances have evolved, right? And some of which is totally beyond my control. And so how can I influence outcomes, and how can I, try and get myself on the best course of action? Well, you'll have to do something a little bit uncomfortable. And so we constantly work on how do you push that envelope? And I do this myself. I'm training for a half marathon right now. I hate running, and I'm terrible at it. And then
I agree with you. I'm horrible at that.
It's just not fun. I'd rather not spend my time doing that. But if I'm here trying to, in integrity, say to people, or being authentic and saying, I'm asking you to change, and I do this with myself. So I'm asking you to lean into something that feels, deliberately uncomfortable, naturally make you contract. And we're going to expand in through that. We're going to expand through uncertainty. We're going to expand into the future. We're going to expand into this darkness and lay down our armor, right? And put aside all of this preparation, or all of this heaviness that we may have, and just lightly, with levity, try and lean into this thing. Then there will be a benefit on the other side, even if you end up somewhere you didn't expect to be.
That is the truth of life. You always end up where you don't expect sometimes. But And that is very much a lot of truth in that idea, and having a harder time with change. It is the element of fear, which is the most dangerous thing. If fear hits you, you don't know how to control it. You're trying to control too many things that are out of your reach, so to speak. Like you can't control other people. You can dictate and say exactly what you want or have expectations, which is also dangerous. But you touched on a point about what I would say is trust factor. And you're hiring on people. How do you have, like you're saying, hire on a different team, get a different people, like understand who you got already in your infrastructure that you're utilizing, how to build that connection? And you touched before on the idea of your upbringing, parents, and your lower, we saw first chakra idea, the first foundation of your moments on here on this planet. So understanding that has secured some certain understandings. But how do you deal with someone when trust is a factor that they hardly trust anything else but themselves?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's tricky, right? But that's what I do, right? This is what I do. And I personally feel like coming from a place of security is helpful for me, because it's easy for me to model that behavior. And so if I go back to, my parents were professional musicians. And so we had a very loving experience. It wasn't always stable financially.
Musicians are never. I'm that too.
but it was always surrounded with love. And so that sort of security, that sort of sense of confidence that you can trust yourself is something that I have. And so when I'm working with folks, and it typically, when we do the psychometric assessments, we can see, and when we do the biographical survey, understanding people's early stage life, I'm not a trained psychologist or psychotherapist, but understanding how somebody got to be where they are and what are the patterns that repeat in their life. Because if you don't see them, right, they will continue to smack you in the face unexpectedly, right? If you choose not to. And so what I try to do with folks is to get ahead of that curve, is to sort of be able to see the patterns before you are, I don't want to say victim, but before you're subjected to them. Because we can look outside and say, hey, the world just did this to me. But a lot of times when we sit down with folks and we do a deeper dive, what we realize is that we're creating the conditions for that to happen through our behavior, right? And so I'll just give you an example and then just a quote. I'll start with a quote, right? Pema Chodron says, nothing ever goes away until it has taught us what we need to learn.
Very wise.
And so that pattern, she's far wiser than I am, but those patterns of behaviors that we have, until we can actually highlight them and see them inside and outside of the workplace, right? And the patterns are really often, they are built into us in that 0 to 18. So how do we adapt to conflict? How do we adapt to lack of trust? How do we adapt to uncertainty? We can understand that very early on. And then typically what happens is our behaviors in reaction to that, they become our armor as we move through life as an adult or as a young adult. And so again, like with anything, if we over-index, there's good and there's bad. And so part of what I try to do when I sit down with folks with a lot of data, right? So we have the biographical survey, we'll have the 360, we'll have the psychometric assessments. And so just really trying to understand, what are the patterns of behavior that are repeated for you? What are continuing to repeat? And I say this, so here's the example, because there's a chapter in the book that talks about we inadvertently create the conditions for the thing we're most afraid of. And that's kind of, it's a lot to digest. Well, actually, let's use trust as a good example, right? So, because you just brought it up. So if I'm not a trusting person, then I'm going to be skeptical when people come up to me. And my skepticism can create the conditions for them to react to them. They're going to be less trusting of me. And so if I create, without realizing, if you're a top of an organization, you can certainly create a culture where people are mistrustful. And I can look out and say, well, there you go. I told you, like, people can't trust in this environment, without even realizing that I was the person who created the conditions for that.
Yes.
And so the thing we fear most is the chapter. It talks about trust or conflict or fear or, relationships. It talks about all these different dimensions where we can actually create the conditions for the thing we're most afraid of by over-indexing, by withdrawing too much and using that as our singular lens.
Interesting.
And so when we can just calm down and just see the world as it is and embrace the bits we can and protect ourselves if we need to from the downside, right? But if we can just exhibit a little bit more of what it is that we're looking for And as I described earlier on, it's moving to the other side of this paradigm. It's moving to the other side of this spectrum and saying, what would happen if there was trust, but with boundaries? What would happen if I was able to lean into this more? More often than not, people will see that they start to erode or minimize their imposition of this thing on the environment.
Yeah, it's very truthful in a way of being an elemental being seen with all the statistics and all the data that you said, client, that you're working on navigating by. You're also mirroring them by calling them out, so to speak, going, you do this on a cyclical cycle. And you touch on a lot of physics quotes, like the idea is like jumping paradigms, jumping over, like there's 9 dimensions, which one do you want to be on today? But in that, it's important to understand that everything is not as straight and narrow. Sometimes it's like, Alan Watts talks about the idea that it's better to go with the flow than try to paddle upstream. But we are forcing, our direction so much that we fail to kind of let go of certain factors to make it an element. So in your experience and how you started Adastra, you are a prime resource for consulting and elements of finding resources for people to kind of have a counterpart. People that are CEOs don't really have like a partnership in something. You can have a vice president, depends on the structure that they designed it by, and a board members that will tell you the truth, you hope. But it's not always that case. What have you learned as opportunities for people to kind of explore having other people's perspective on an equal level?
Yeah. There are a lot of sort of organizational or institutional approaches to this, right? So you can have a consulting firm, they can present the world from the outside in, but they may also have their bias. There are sort of emergent organizations. So if I think about maybe the YPO, right, or Vistage, is people who are at that level, but outside of their organization, who come together, or Chief would be a good example, where we're sort of coalescing around, we have a common interest, but we're not in the same organization, so there's no conflict of interest.
Yes.
That's one way that people can do it. But of course, somebody like, the work we do at Adastra, we can be that too, right? So it's understanding somebody, and it's a very privileged spot that we occupy, and we don't take it lightly, because we're able to see somebody's personal life in a way that people inside work don't see. And we're able to see somebody's professional life in the way that people outside of work don't see. And I always like to say to folks, like, the objective when we finish working with you is the people that you've chosen to be in your life, not the ones that you're paid to be around and they're paid to be around you.
Yes.
But the people that you choose to be in your life, and you've chosen them to be in your life, friends or family, and they're going to be there hopefully 10, 15, 20 years from now, that they can see a difference. They can see an evolution in you as a function of the work that we do together. Because if they do, it's normally correlation is 1-for-1. We normally see it in the workplace. And so sometimes that allows people to just, sort of relax their guard a little bit and say, okay, so I can go and practice outside of work. Yes, you can. You don't have to just do this in the workplace. You can practice outside of work too. And then suddenly the landscape opens up and they've got 24 hours in a day if they choose to be working on themselves and to being better, a better leader and a better person. And so, to your point earlier on, the universe gives us cues, right? It's only a question of whether we decide, to your point about Alan Watts, right? The universe will give us this feedback. The universe gives us cues, and it's really just up to us to decide. Are we going to push through them? Right? Are we going to just, decide that we're right? Or are we going to listen to them and adapt? And so part of this process is anchored in this. We're trying to ground people in this idea about being aware and being able to listen to the cues better than they did beforehand. And so, that's typically the process they go through.
I believe it's very important for like cues and understandings of, everything is linked, because it's only you at the center, so to speak. Your life is centered around you, your connections, your friendships, your family, your business. Every element will pair with each other with the same results if you see it that way. If that's your viewpoint on your stature and what you've experienced before, you will create it again, because that's a cycle that we talked about, but also your framework on it and how to execute something that, you can create, but not having true ownership with it in a way, that it's like it has its own understanding and its own vibe and its own like creation. You need some elements to kind of continue forward. But when you get to a point where anything in the universe is like making it difficult, making it like, no, have you not figured this out this time? Did you need to go and do it again? Because it's that idea that the universe is telling you to shift out, work on self, figure out your grounding, figure out your way of, reframing or reworking, however you're going to do it, go outside, go to the gym, certain things like that, habits, are important for those elements to kind of shift paradigms. But it is a hard factor for some that are immensely stubborn or hate change. And you are a prime resource of that. And I applaud your career and your expertise. It's always hard for people to find someone in your pursuits that is also what we talked about before, a little trust factor. Like, I'm sharing a lot with you. It's not a therapist, but it's very much an intimate procedure that I would have to share my life and my understanding and my perspectives without being too much judged, but also corrected in my own way that I need some help. And that is true with everyone. So in your explorations, what do you think the most important element maybe missing or needs to be reworked in the leadership concept in humanity today?
Wow.
Very deep question for one of
Yeah, like I think there's a lot of dissonance. I talked about this when we first kicked off. Like I think there is a lot of dissonance and there's a lot of information that can saturate. It's very easy to sort of get confused and end up down a rabbit hole in all kinds of different areas. I think, if we come back to, you said something about what is the human aspect or the human element of leadership. And I think that's the thing that, I would encourage us to consider or stay focused on, is that, people, you really don't know. And I say this to most of the leaders I work with, there's never any judgment when I work with folks. I promise them a non-judgmental area, right? A zone for us to operate in. But one of the mistakes I see most leaders making is not understanding the motivations of the people around them. And I think, I was guilty of this for a period of time, but I'd be like, well, why aren't people working, as hard as I am? And why aren't, why don't they care as much as I do? And at some point I had to realize, okay, yeah, well, you're in charge, Jamie. Like you have some skin in the game here. Like this is your, you're operating this business. Not understanding the motivations or not taking the time to pause and just allow people the space to sort of breathe or express themselves. I think there's something that we could be doing more of that of. It feels like, there's more expectation, the outside world is telling us more and more what we should be and who we should like and how we should aspire. And I think sort of getting centered and grounded, being able to run your own race, right? Being able to sort of center yourself on what's important to you and not what's important to other people. And in doing so, that actually makes you more tolerant and compassionate with the people who are around you.
True. We also need tolerance and compassion, empathy that you just touched on. And it's an important idea that we're not an algorithm. We're not an AI. We are imperfection, but also still here to live our lives and make our impact, because you touched on the idea of purpose. It is very hard for people to find what their purpose is. And I've seen it when they don't really know how to or what to do to find that direction. And it's a valuable idea that people can find it.
What's interesting. And so, and I think part of the mistake might be thinking that our purpose is in what we do for work, right? Sometimes it isn't in that. Sometimes, we can find what we are energized by, but it doesn't have to be defined by the workplace. Now, as a leader, what I want to do is get people who are organized, who can see the world the same way, or interested in being in the mission. But they may be motivated differently than I am. It may not be the fullest self-expression for them. It may just be something transactional, right? It may be. I realize this may come to sort of one of the lessons I learned. We had somebody in our group who, as we were building the business, when I worked this organization, we were in a very bad state when I first joined. So we were the bottom 5% of global suppliers. Part of my rise to the CEO was me and a group of people said, well, it can be better than this. And so we took in feedback. We followed the process that I just talked about. We took on really clear and truthful feedback about how bad we were. And we acknowledged that and said, we're not a very good supplier right now today, but we're going to be better. And we enlisted the help of our clients who'd given us that feedback and thought about how can we build on that. And we did these 90-day sprints or 90-day cycles about how do we build capacity and capability inside the organization, so that at the time our quality, cost, and delivery was really poor, which, the morale was low, attrition was high. It was just a bit of a mess. And so, over these 90-day sprints, taking in feedback from our clients and using them to guide us on how we will improve. Within 18 months, we went from the bottom 5% to the top 5 in the global supply chain. So we were able to really, see transformational results. But through that journey, not everybody was committed in the same way. The group of us, a very small group of us who were working 16-hour days and, 6 days a week for a period, not everybody was committed. For some people, it was simply transactional. And I think when you can understand that, you understand you're not asking people to do things they're not prepared to do. Because the definition of unhappiness is having an expectation that isn't met. And so, you don't do that. You're simply calibrated, right? You're aware of not just yourself, but other people and what their motivations are. And I think without judgment, right? So if somebody doesn't want to do that, but they're going to come in and do a decent job, they don't have to be an A triple plus player who's, motivated by what this mission is. They may just be somebody who wants to come in and transact, and their passions and their purpose are outside of the organization. And just being able to say that's okay too. And just being able to deal with what you have, deploy the assets you have, or use the resources that are at your disposal. That again helps you to, not fall into this trap, which ultimately is dissatisfying, of asking an organization or asking people within the organization to do something that they're not committing to do.
True. I mean, it's like you can't recraft someone else's purposes for your own needs, but you have to see people like they are, to utilize their skill sets and what they do and what they like to do. Because I always, being a woman, and most people have it too, just, tapping into trust your gut and what it's saying. And like, if this is making you have a happy moment or you're enjoying the experience, this is a good direction. If it's you're depleted, you feel exhausted, you're just thrown asunder, so to speak, and then you can't really figure out if you're going the right purpose direction because mentally you're unhinged or or you're missing the point because you're too either barred up or you're not figuring out kind of how to navigate it better. But it is very defining to understand that people have other purposes beside your direction, and they're utilizable skills that you can pull from those people, but not everybody is going to have your same mission and understanding of purpose.
Yeah, I was going to say, just to that point, when I did my research, for my master's, one of the things that came out of it is I asked senior executives, like, when you think of great leadership, right, what does it look like for you? And in most of the cases, it might have even been eight or 9 times out of 10, the people they described were not in the workplace. So leadership for them was somebody who would, was manifesting like that aspiration, the purpose was something that's outside of the workplace. And so if you walk into work thinking, well, everybody is going to be super passionate and really dialed in, and they're going to want this thing as much as I do, you're going to be disappointed at some point, right? And also then giving yourself permission to say, well, it's okay if I don't, get a massive sense of meaning and purpose out of work, but I can find something that aligns. I can find something that aligns with who I am and who I want to be and what I want to accomplish.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost a touch point on one of my final questions about what is the best advice you've ever received?
Yeah. Well, I think about the people that I looked to when I was, as leadership models in my life. And my grandmother was the first female mayor in 400 years of my hometown. So she was a force of nature. She really was like a hurricane, like, when she set her mind to something. And she lived a life of service. She really did serve the people and the population right up until, in her 90s, she was still, fundraising for charity. And, she'd always say to me, Jamie, just do the best you can, right? Like, that's all you can do. And I think that was really, again, centering and grounding for me, I think is a great antidote to imposter syndrome, actually. So if anybody, if any of your listeners are suffering from imposter syndrome, because for me, what that manifested itself as is whenever I take on a new role, it doesn't mean I didn't have versions of imposter syndrome. But, it just meant that I said, well, I'm just going to do the best I can. Like, if I think about, there's a spectrum of people who've done it really badly and some people have done it really, really well. And so as long as I'm somewhere in between, it will be okay. I'm just going to do the best I can with what I have, and that will be okay. And so, that sort of teaches you to stay in this sense of perspective around there's always going to be somebody better than you, and there's typically going to be somebody worse than you. And so, so where do you want to be on that spectrum? And if it's really important to you, you want to gravitate towards the end of people who are really good. But if it's not, then that's okay too. Like, you can still be good enough.
Yeah, just valuing you is part of it. I just did something about, exactly what you're talking about. And the idea, I did a good day. I had a great day. I did this, like give you some compliments, like understanding the truth of it, because, you can't be the best of everything. You just have to be the best of you. And that is, your grandmother was a wise woman and lived an appropriate life in a way that she can resonate to teach you those things, because her life demonstrated the words that she chose to kind of impart to you. And it's a very moral stance of understanding who you are, and you are valued in her view, and she's guiding you in that direction. So my last question is always, what is the best takeaways from the worst or the most difficult moment in your life? And what did you learn from it? And what did you gain from it?
Yeah, well, I think I had, when my career was starting out, I was based in Europe. I went to a meeting one time. We had a line of new products. And so I traveled all the way to the north of Scotland. It took me like a day and a half to get there. The car broke down and I had to take the train, and we had 30 new products and that we were going to talk through. And when I sat with the person across the table, as I went through the products, they're like, no, not interested in that, not interested in that. And the meeting it couldn't have taken more than like 15 minutes. It was like absolutely demoralizing. And so I sort of, and I said, okay, well, can we grab lunch or get coffee? No, I'm busy. And so literally after a day and a half travel, we had a 20-minute meeting, and I had to get back on the phone with my boss and say, that was a disaster. And this was probably one of the first, very early in my career. And, what that taught me is that it's actually sometimes not about you. Right? So there are constraints that somebody might have that you're not aware of. There are invisible forces at play. And so sometimes that big rejection that you get, and that was literally a day and a half then traveling back, thinking I've messed this up, I'm going to get fired, my boss hates me, that the client's never going to buy anything from us again. And it turns out that there was something that there was something that I had no control over that was going on inside their organization. And so I think sometimes with hindsight, you can sort of, you take a step back and you soak and digest and you understand what's the role that you played. Could I prepare any different? Could I be any better? Or did I just give it the best shot? I did the best I could with what I had. And so, and even in that point, when you understand that there are invisible forces that are in the way and the universe is giving you these messages, you can choose whether it's important enough to push through them, right? And just be aware enough to say, this is worth the effort. Or to your point, about what is that sometimes I'm just going to course correct. I'm just going to adapt my approach and adapt the way that I see this and adapt my framework or my mindset in order to be successful, in order to, get the gains that I need to get for myself and the people around me. And so that's kind of informed, the leadership that I had when I was CEO, and also the way that I coach CEOs today.
Amazing truths. And it's also important to understand everybody has those moments and what you learn from it when you had a failure, so to speak, in every way you can imagine, and you just feel like you didn't do it well and you didn't shy away from going in it out again, and you consistently grew with it and learned from it. And so I applaud your journey, and I am excited about your book, Let's Go, How Great Leaders Shape the Future. And it is a great book if you're out there wanting to get into leadership roles. If you're a CEO, you need to check out Jamie Ramsden's business, Adastra Consulting, and his leadership development and excellent executive coach company. So it is an amazing asset if you're looking for some infrastructure working on you as a person in your role of, and if you can't, pick up the book. It's really good. But thank you, Jamie, very much for your time and all your information that you imparted today.
Thank you, Jasmine. It's a real pleasure. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com. Thank you for tuning in to the Tranquility Magazine podcast. Please subscribe and add your questions to our Q&A. We want to give a thank you to our team for their effort in creating every episode and our content at tranquilitymagazine.com.